Jack's sneakers crunched through the dry, amber-colored leaves that had fallen overnight, blanketing the sidewalk on his walk home from school. Autumn was his favorite time of year, with its crisp air and golden light. It was also a busy time, especially for his family. Jack's mother, Claire, worked 2 jobs to keep their modest home running, and Jack often helped out wherever he could. After school, he'd rake their own yard, sometimes taking on odd jobs for neighbors to bring in a few extra dollars for groceries. As Jack rounded the corner onto his street, he noticed Mrs. Kensington in her yard. The elderly woman, dressed in a heavy cardigan and knit scarf, was struggling to rake the leaves that had piled up on her lawn. She moved slowly, leaning on the rake like a walking stick. Jack hesitated for a moment. Mrs. Kensington wasn't like the other neighbors who waved and chatted when he passed. She kept to herself, rarely seen outside her house except to collect the mail or tend to her garden. There were rumors among the neighborhood kids that she was a bit of a recluse. Jack had heard stories half made up. He was sure about how she'd yell at kids who accidentally kicked a ball into her yard. But watching her struggle now, those stories seemed hard to believe. "Do you need some help, Ma?" Jack called, stepping closer to the fence that bordered her yard. Mrs. Kensington looked up, startled. Her face, lined with years Jack couldn't begin to count, softened into something like surprise. "Oh, I don't know," she said, her voice quivering. "I've got it, young man. You don't need to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," Jack said, hopping over the low fence. "I'm pretty good at this," actually. Without waiting for her permission, he picked up the spare rake leaning against her porch and got to work. For the first few minutes, they worked in silence. Jack cleared leaves into neat piles while Mrs. Kensington moved slowly along the edges of the yard, gathering what she could. When the last pile was bagged, Jack turned to her and grinned. "See? Much faster with 2 people." Mrs. Kensington regarded him carefully. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though there was a trace of warmth in her tone. "But, thank you, it's been harder to keep up with the yard work lately." "It's no problem," Jack replied, brushing off his hands. "I can come by again next week if you want." Her eyes widened slightly, as if the offer surprised her. "Well, I suppose, if you're sure you have the time." Jack nodded. "I'll be here." From that day on, Jack started stopping by Mrs. Kensington's house every Saturday afternoon. At first, it was just raking leaves or shoveling snow after a storm, but before long she began asking for help with other small tasks, pruning her rose bushes, bringing in groceries, or fixing squeaky cabinet doors. Mrs. Kensington remained reserved, but as the weeks passed, she began to open up. She told Jack about her late husband, Robert, who had passed away over a decade ago, and about her children who lived far away and rarely visited. "They're busy with their own lives," she said one day with a wistful smile. "I don't blame them, but it does get lonely sometimes." Jack nodded, listening as he worked. He didn't know what it was like to be lonely. His life was noisy and full, even if money was tight. But he could tell that Mrs. Kensington's house, with its pristine furniture and quiet halls, held echoes of a life that felt far away. One Saturday, as Jack was stacking firewood by the back porch, Mrs. Kensington brought out 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. She handed one to him and sat down on the porch swing, motioning for him to join her. "You're a good boy, Jack," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Not many your age would take the time to help an old woman like me." Jack shrugged, a little embarrassed. "It's not a big deal. My mom says we should help people if we can." "Your mother raised you right," Mrs. Kensington replied, her gaze distant for a moment. Then she smiled. "Robert used to say that kindness is the best thing you can leave behind in this world." The words stuck with Jack long after he went home that day. As the weeks turned into months, their routine became part of Jack's life. He began to look forward to his afternoons at Mrs. Kensington's house. Not just because of the warm drinks or the occasional homemade cookies she baked, but because of the stories she shared. She told him about her childhood during the Great Depression, about her favorite books, and about the garden parties she used to host when her children were young. Jack, in turn, talked about school, his friends, and his plans for the future. He wanted to go to college someday, though he wasn't sure how they would afford it. Mrs. Kensington always listened intently, her eyes lighting up at his dreams. One afternoon, as Jack was repairing a broken birdhouse in her yard, Mrs. Kensington sat nearby, sipping tea. "Jack," she said suddenly, "I don't think I've told you how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. You've made these last few months brighter." Jack looked up, surprised. "It's nothing, really. I like helping you." She smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "You're a good boy," she said again, almost to herself. Jack didn't think much of it at the time. The autumn leaves eventually gave way to winter snow, and Jack continued to visit, shoveling Mrs. Kensington's driveway and checking in to make sure she had everything she needed. It wasn't always easy. There were times when Jack had to turn down invitations from friends or skip an afternoon playing video games to help out. But he never regretted it. What Jack didn't know was how much these simple acts meant to Mrs. Kensington. To her, Jack's visits weren't just a convenience, they were a lifeline. A reminder that she wasn't forgotten in the quiet of her days. As the first snow of December blanketed the neighborhood, Jack headed home from Mrs. Kensington's house with a bag of cookies she had insisted he take. He didn't know it then, but the life he had touched would soon touch his own in ways he couldn't imagine. The snow arrived earlier than usual that year, turning the streets and yards into a postcard scene of glistening white. Jack pulled on his boots and coat one Saturday afternoon, prepared to shovel Mrs. Kensington's driveway as promised. When he arrived, he found her standing on the porch with a thermos of tea and a wool scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "Jack, you're going to wear yourself out coming here every week," she said as he waved and began clearing the driveway. "Nah. I'm used to it," Jack replied, leaning on the shovel for a moment. "Besides, I like it here. It's peaceful." Mrs. Kensington chuckled. "Peaceful? That's a polite way of saying boring, isn't it?" Jack grinned. "Not boring. Just calm. I don't mind." She smiled and retreated inside, but Jack noticed she stayed by the window, watching him as he worked. Over the following weeks, their relationship transformed into something more like a friendship. It started with little things, Mrs. Kensington asking Jack to stay a little longer after finishing his tasks or offering him extra cookies for his trouble. Eventually, he found himself sitting at her kitchen table after each job, chatting over hot cocoa or tea. Mrs. Kensington had a sharp sense of humor that surprised Jack at first. One day, when Jack was rearranging a few stubborn books on her high shelf, she quipped, "If I knew I'd have a handyman this good, I would have let that shelf break years ago." Jack laughed so hard he nearly dropped the book in his hand. "Careful now," she added with mock seriousness. "That edition's older than you and probably worth more too." Jack enjoyed these moments, and he began to see Mrs. Kensington differently. She wasn't just the quiet old lady in the big house, she was a person with stories, opinions, and a wry wit that often made him laugh. One snowy afternoon, as they sat in her living room by the fireplace, Mrs. Kensington asked, "Do you ever think about the kind of life you want, Jack?" Jack hesitated. "Sometimes. I know I want to go to college and do something that makes a difference. Maybe be a teacher or a counselor, something like that. My mom says I have a knack for helping people." Mrs. Kensington nodded, her eyes bright with interest. "Those are fine goals. But don't let anything hold you back, Jack. You're a smart young man, and the world needs more people who care." He smiled, grateful for her encouragement. "Thanks, Mrs. Kensington. That means a lot." "You should call me Eleanor," she said suddenly. Jack blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" She chuckled. "Of course. After all this time, it seems silly for you to be so formal." "All right. Eleanor," Jack said, trying out the name. It felt strange at first, but it made her smile, and that was enough for him. As winter wore on, Jack spent more time with Eleanor than he had expected. Sometimes he'd come by after school just to sit with her and talk. She began to look forward to his visits, preparing tea or baking her famous shortbread cookies. For Jack, her house became a sort of second home, a quiet refuge where he could escape the pressures of school and the struggles his family faced. One particularly cold afternoon, Eleanor asked Jack if he'd like to see something special. She led him to a small room at the back of the house that Jack hadn't entered before. Inside was a treasure trove of keepsakes, old photographs, letters, and heirlooms that told the story of her life. This, she said, pointing to a framed photo of a young couple, was taken on my wedding day. Robert and I were married in 1965. He was my best friend, my partner in everything. We didn't have much then, but we were happy. Jack studied the photo, noting how radiant Eleanor looked. "You look really happy," he said. "We were," she replied with a smile. Robert was a kind man. He always believed in giving back, no matter how little we had, she sighed, her eyes misty. "I miss him every day, but I'm grateful for the life we had together." Eleanor then pointed to another photo, this one of two young children playing in a sunny backyard. "These are my children, Margaret and Daniel. They were my whole world when they were little." "Where are they now?" Jack asked. "Oh, they're off living their lives," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "Margaret's in Seattle and Daniel's in Boston. They have families of their own now, and they're very busy." Jack sensed the ache in her words. "Do they visit often?" "Not as often as I'd like," she admitted. "But I understand. Life gets complicated." Jack felt a pang of sadness for Eleanor, imagining how lonely she must feel at times. He resolved to keep visiting her as much as he could. As spring approached, the snow melted, revealing the first signs of green in Eleanor's garden. Jack helped her clean up the flower beds and prepare for planting. She taught him how to care for roses, showing him the proper way to prune and fertilize them. "You're a natural," she said as he carefully tied a climbing rose to its trellis. Jack grinned. "Maybe I'll start a gardening business someday." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, if you do, I'll be your first customer." Their bond grew deeper with each passing season, and Jack began to see Eleanor as more than just a neighbor. She was a friend, a mentor, and in some ways, a grandmother figure he never knew he needed. What Jack didn't realize was that his kindness had rekindled something in Eleanor too. Her days, once so quiet and routine, now had a sense of purpose and joy she hadn't felt in years. She found herself laughing more, sharing more, and looking forward to each visit with Jack as if it were a gift. One day, as they sat together on her porch, watching the sunset, Eleanor turned to Jack and said, "You've made my days so much brighter, Jack. I hope you know how much that means to me." Jack felt a lump in his throat. "You've made my days better too, Eleanor. I'm glad we're friends." She reached over and patted his hand. "So am I, Jack. So am I." Unbeknownst to Jack, these moments with Eleanor were planting seeds that would change his life forever. The warmth of spring blossomed into summer, and Jack's weekly visits to Eleanor's house became a steady rhythm in both of their lives. Her once quiet garden now thrived with blooms of every color, thanks to Jack's diligent care and Eleanor's guidance. It was during these months that their friendship solidified into something special. Jack began to see Eleanor not just as a neighbor in need, but as a true friend, a person whose wisdom and kindness had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Eleanor, in turn, found her spirits lifted in Jack's presence. His youthful energy and laughter brought life back to her home, filling the empty spaces left by years of solitude. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows over the garden, Jack brought his mother, Claire, to meet Eleanor for the first time. "She's always wanted to meet you," Jack told Eleanor as he set a tray of lemonade on the table. Claire, a warm but tired woman with gentle eyes, extended her hand. "Thank you for being so kind to my boy, Mrs. Kensington. He talks about you all the time." "Please call me Eleanor," she replied with a smile, shaking Claire's hand. And if anyone's been kind, it's your son. He's been a blessing in my life. Claire looked at Jack with pride. He's a good kid. I've tried to teach him to help where he can, but he's taken it to heart more than I ever expected. The three of them spent the afternoon chatting, laughing, and sharing stories. Eleanor told Claire about her late husband, Robert, and her children, Margaret and Daniel. She even shared some funny anecdotes about Jack's less graceful moments in the garden, like the time he accidentally stepped into a freshly planted flower bed. Jack groaned, his face turning red. "You're never going to let me forget that, are you?" "Never," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. The visit left an impression on Claire. On their walk home, she put a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "What you're doing for Eleanor is more important than you know." Jack felt a swell of warmth in his chest. He didn't think of his time with Eleanor as a duty, it was just something he enjoyed. But life has a way of moving forward, often faster than anyone expects. By the time the leaves began to change again, Jack was back in school and juggling his growing responsibilities. Homework, friends, and after-school activities filled his days, yet he never missed his weekly visits to Eleanor. Then, one chilly October morning, Jack noticed something unusual. The curtains in Eleanor's front window were still drawn, and her porch, usually swept clean, was scattered with leaves. Concerned, Jack knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he tried again. Louder this time. Still nothing. "No." Jack's stomach twisted with unease as he hurried home to tell his mother. Claire made a few phone calls, and soon after, Jack learned the news. Eleanor had passed away in her sleep the previous night. The loss hit Jack harder than he expected. For the first time, he realized how much Eleanor had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a friend, a mentor, and a constant presence in his life. At the small, intimate funeral service, Jack and his mother sat among a few other mourners, including Eleanor's grown children, Margaret and Daniel. Jack couldn't help but notice how different they seemed from the woman he'd known. While polite, they were distant, speaking of Eleanor more as a figure from their childhood than the vibrant person she had been to Jack. After the service, Margaret approached Jack. "You're the boy who helped my mother, aren't you?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Yes, Ma, I am. I just tried to be there for her when I could." Margaret's expression softened. "Thank you for that. I know we weren't able to visit as often as we should have. It's comforting to know she had someone looking out for her." Jack didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. The weeks that followed were quiet and heavy. Jack still found himself walking past Eleanor's house, the sight of it stirring a mixture of sadness and fondness. The garden, once vibrant and alive, seemed to wilt without her care. One afternoon, as Jack was helping his mother sort through bills at the kitchen table, the phone rang. Claire answered, her face quickly shifting from confusion to surprise. "Yes, he's here," she said, covering the receiver. "Jack. It's for you. A lawyer." Jack took the phone, his palms sweating. The man on the other end introduced himself as the executor of Eleanor's estate. "Jack, I'm calling because Mrs. Kensington included you in her will," the man said. Jack blinked, stunned. "Her will? Me? Why?" "She left you something significant," the lawyer continued. "Could you and your mother come to my office tomorrow to discuss the details?" Jack's mind raced as he handed the phone back to his mother. He couldn't imagine what Eleanor could have left for him. The thought of it filled him with both curiosity and sadness, a reminder of the friend he had lost. The next day, Jack and Claire sat in a quiet office as the lawyer read Eleanor's will aloud. Most of her estate, her house, savings, and possessions was left to Margaret and Daniel. But to Jack, she had left $100,000. Jack's jaw dropped. His mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She said it was her way of thanking you for the kindness and companionship you gave her in her final years," the lawyer explained. "This $100,000 gift is part of her larger estate, which was substantial." Mrs. Kensington was, in fact, a millionaire, though she lived quietly and kept her wealth private. Jack froze, his mind struggling to process the words. A millionaire, he repeated, incredulous. The lawyer nodded. Her investments and properties accumulated significant value over the years. While much of her estate went to her children, she made it clear she wanted to acknowledge you in a meaningful way. She admired the care and kindness you showed her, expecting nothing in return. Jack sat back in his chair, stunned. To him, Eleanor had never seemed wealthy. Her home was elegant but modest, and she never flaunted her status. He thought of her stories, her garden, her laugh, all the things that had made her so special to him. I didn't know, he murmured. She didn't want you to, the lawyer said gently. She wanted your relationship to remain genuine. And it did. Jack and his mother left the office in stunned silence. It wasn't until they got home that the weight of Eleanor's gift truly hit him. She had seen something in him, something worth investing in. And for Jack, that meant more than the money ever could. The weight of Eleanor's gift hung in the air like a whispered secret. Jack couldn't fully grasp what $100,000 even meant. Their lives had always been measured in tight budgets, scraped together grocery lists, and secondhand clothes. Now, the possibilities seemed endless, yet strangely overwhelming. Claire sat across from him at the kitchen table that evening, running her hands over the envelope containing the details of the inheritance. Jack, this is incredible. This could change so much for us, she said, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, still absorbing it all. I don't even know what to do with it, Mom. It feels too much. Claire reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Eleanor saw something in you. She trusted you to make good choices. And we will. Over the next few days, Jack and Claire carefully discussed how to use the money. They decided to pay off the lingering debts that had weighed on their family for years, starting with the overdue bills that kept Claire awake at night. Afterward, they set aside a portion for Jack's future college tuition, something they had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Still, Jack felt uneasy. Eleanor's generosity was overwhelming, and he struggled with the idea of accepting it. It doesn't feel right, he confessed to Claire one evening. I didn't help her because I wanted anything back. I just liked being around her. Claire smiled gently. That's exactly why she gave it to you. It wasn't about what you did. It was about who you are. Jack found comfort in those words, though the sadness of losing Eleanor lingered. He missed their long talks and the quiet joy of working together in her garden. The house, now empty and quiet, was a stark reminder of her absence. One day, as Jack walked past Eleanor's house, he noticed Margaret and Daniel standing by the garden, discussing what to do with the property. The once thriving garden had begun to fade without Eleanor's care, and the sight filled Jack with a deep longing to preserve something of her legacy. He hesitated before approaching them. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Daniel, he said, his voice tentative. They turned to him, their faces softening with recognition. Jack, Margaret said warmly, we've been meaning to talk to you. Thank you for everything you did for our mother. She cared about you so much. Jack shuffled his feet, unsure of how to respond. I cared about her too. She was like family to me. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. We've been thinking about what to do with the house. It's too far for either of us to manage, and it's a lot of work. But we'd hate to see it go to strangers. An idea sparked in Jack's mind, one that had been quietly forming since he first heard about the inheritance. What if we kept the garden going? Not just for your mom, but for the neighborhood? She loved it so much, and I think it could mean a lot to other people too. Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances. That's a beautiful idea, Daniel said after a moment. But it would take a lot of work. Jack straightened, his voice steady. I'll do it. I can use some of the money Eleanor left me to fix up the garden, and I'll make sure it stays cared for. It can be a way to honor her. The siblings looked at each other again, this time with soft smiles. Our mother would have loved that, Margaret said. If you're sure, we'd be happy to support you in any way we can. Over the next few weeks, Jack poured his heart into restoring the garden. He enlisted the help of friends and neighbors, many of whom had fond memories of Eleanor and were eager to contribute. Together, they cleared weeds, planted new flowers, and repaired the worn trellises and birdhouses that had once been Eleanor's pride. The project brought the community together in a way Jack hadn't expected. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another began sharing stories about Eleanor, her kindness, her quiet humor, and the way she always seemed to know exactly when someone needed a cup of tea. By late spring, the garden was alive again, bursting with color and life. Jack added a small wooden bench near Eleanor's favorite climbing roses, along with a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Eleanor Kensington, a life that bloomed with kindness." On the day the garden was officially completed, Margaret and Daniel returned to see the transformation. They walked through the rows of flowers, tears in their eyes. "You've given her a legacy," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is more than we could have ever hoped for." Jack smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "She gave me so much. This was the least I could do." As the months passed, the garden became a cherished part of the neighborhood. Children played among the flowers, families gathered for picnics, and elderly neighbors found comfort in its beauty. Jack visited often, tending to the plants and finding solace in the memories of Eleanor's laughter and stories. In the process, Jack discovered something profound. Eleanor's gift wasn't just the money. It was the lesson she had taught him that kindness, no matter how small, could leave a lasting mark on the world. The garden blossomed into a sanctuary of colors and memories. It had become a centerpiece for the neighborhood, a place where people gathered to celebrate birthdays, read quietly on sunny afternoons, or simply enjoy the beauty around them. Jack visited often, pruning the roses and making sure the plants stayed healthy, just as Eleanor had taught him. As Jack worked in the garden one warm summer evening, Margaret stopped by. She carried a small box tucked under her arm, her face alight with a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing Jack the box. "It's some of my mother's things. I thought you might like to have them." Jack opened the lid carefully. Inside were small, cherished items: an embroidered handkerchief, a set of gardening gloves worn soft from use, and a faded leather-bound journal. At the bottom of the box was a photograph of Eleanor, younger but unmistakably herself, standing in front of a blooming rose bush. "She kept this journal for years," Margaret said. "It's mostly little notes about her garden, but there are some other thoughts too. I think she wrote about you in there toward the end." Jack's chest tightened with emotion as he thumbed through the pages, catching glimpses of Eleanor's handwriting. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That night, Jack sat at his desk, carefully reading through the journal. Eleanor's entries were a mix of gardening tips, reflections on her late husband, and musings on life. Then, near the last pages, Jack found a note that made his throat catch. "Jack has brought light into my days in a way I never expected. His kindness, his laughter, his presence, they've reminded me of all the beauty life still holds. I hope he knows how much he's meant to me." Tears filled Jack's eyes as he closed the journal. Eleanor's words weren't just a reflection of what he had done for her, they were a testament to the bond they had shared, one built on simple acts of kindness and the willingness to care. Over the next few years, Jack carried Eleanor's memory with him like a quiet flame. He graduated from high school, and, with the inheritance Eleanor had left him, went on to attend college. True to his word, he studied to become a counselor, inspired by the way Eleanor had listened to him and encouraged his dreams. When he wasn't at school, Jack continued to tend the garden, which had become more than a place of beauty. It was a living reminder of the connection he and Eleanor had shared. The neighbors often remarked how much the garden meant to them, and Jack felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that Eleanor's kindness continued to ripple outward. Years later, Jack returned to the neighborhood as a young man, this time not as a boy raking leaves but as someone who had been shaped by those small, meaningful moments. The garden was still there, thriving as it always had, and Jack made sure it remained a place where anyone could find peace and connection. On one particularly bright afternoon, a little girl from the neighborhood approached Jack as he worked near the climbing roses. She tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Is this your garden?" she asked. Jack smiled, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Not just mine, it belongs to everyone. But it started because of a very kind woman who taught me how important it is to take care of things and people." The girl's face lit up. "Can I help?" "Of course," Jack said, handing her a small trowel. As they worked side by side, Jack felt a quiet joy that reminded him of those early days with Eleanor. Her lessons, her generosity, and her friendship had left a mark, not just on his life but on everyone who walked through the garden she had inspired. And in that moment, surrounded by blooming roses and laughter, Jack understood something deeply. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the garden, the inheritance, or the memories. It was in the way her kindness had planted seeds that continued to grow, reaching far beyond anything she could have imagined.